Elena had lived in the small western town for almost 3 years, yet she still felt like an outsider most of the time. The town was quiet, the kind of place where days passed slowly, and everyone knew everyone else's habits, schedules, and moods. People waved politely, greeted each other, shared stories at the general store, and often helped one another without even being asked. But even in a peaceful place like this, life could still place heavy weight on a person's shoulders, and Elena carried a silent load no one else could see. She worked at the ranch office, an old wooden building with windows that creaked whenever the wind pushed through. It wasn't a hard job on paper, but it was demanding in its own way. She handled accounts, tallied feed orders, updated cattle records, and organized schedules. Most days, she arrived before sunrise and left only when everyone else was gone. People admired her dedication. They thought she simply loved her work. But the truth was deeper and far more painful. Mark, the cowboy who worked with the cattle and handled most of the outdoor labor, was one of the first to notice something unusual. He wasn't the type to involve himself in other people's business unless they asked. He respected space, privacy, and boundaries. But he had a sharp eye, sharp enough to see when something wasn't right. He often walked past the office to check on the animals or collect paperwork. He would see Elena sitting at her desk, shoulders tense, lips pressed together as if trying to hold something inside. She sometimes rubbed her temple, sometimes took deep breaths as if steadying herself. A few times, Mark saw her reach for her bag with trembling hands, as if the day had drained everything from her. Still, she always forced a small smile whenever he greeted her. He would tip his hat. She would nod politely, and neither would say more than a simple, "Good evening." But the silence around her always felt heavy, like a weighted blanket she was trapped under. One warm afternoon, Mark headed toward the barn with a toolbox in hand. He had been asked to fix the loose boards on one of the horse stalls. As he walked, he saw Elena struggling with a stack of old ledgers. They looked heavy, too heavy for her frame. She tried to lift the entire stack at once, but halfway across the yard, the books slipped out of her arms and fell to the ground with a loud thud. The sound made Mark turn immediately. When he reached her, she was already kneeling, gathering the scattered papers quickly, her face red with embarrassment. She whispered something under her breath, a small apology to the air, as if she had done something wrong by dropping them. Mark kneeled beside her without saying anything. He grabbed the nearest book and gently added it to her pile. She shook her head, insisting she could handle it, but her voice was quiet, almost strained. "It's all right," Mark told her softly. "Let me help." She hesitated, but after a moment, she let her hands fall away. Mark gathered every book and stood up with ease. Elena stood too, brushing dust off her skirt, avoiding his eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and carried the ledgers inside the office for her. She followed behind, but she didn't speak again. He set the books down on the table and stepped back. Before he could ask if she needed anything else, she was already busy arranging the books, trying to hide the shaking in her fingers. Mark watched for a second, wanting to say something encouraging, but he didn't want to intrude. So he simply tipped his hat and walked back outside. Over the next few days, he noticed more signs. Elena skipped lunch often. Sometimes he saw her sitting in the corner of the barn, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts that clearly troubled her. Other times she looked like she wanted to cry but pressed her lips tight to hold it in. She grew thinner from skipping meals, and her steps became slower. Yet she never complained. Mark didn't push. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he began offering help in small ways, hoping she wouldn't feel uncomfortable. When she had boxes to move, he lifted them without being asked. When she needed papers delivered across the ranch, he took them for her. When she seemed tired, he offered water or a seat, pretending it was just casual politeness. Sometimes she accepted. Sometimes She politely refused. But she always looked grateful, even if she didn't say it. The turning point came one late afternoon when the sky was turning golden. Elena had stepped outside for a moment of air. She held a folded letter in her hand. Mark was passing by on his way to the stables when he noticed her standing completely still, as if the world had stopped around her. Her eyes were fixed on the letter, her breathing uneven. Before Mark could greet her, her knees gave out, and she sat heavily on the wooden steps beside the stable. Her hands shook violently, and the letter slipped from her fingers onto the ground. Mark rushed toward her, kneeling down at once. "Elena, are you all right?" She tried to answer, but only managed a faint sound. Her eyes were wet, but she wiped them quickly, as if ashamed of showing emotion. She reached for the letter with trembling fingers but couldn't steady her hand enough to pick it up. Mark gently picked up the letter and placed it in her hands. He didn't try to read it or ask what it said. He simply wanted her to hold it, without struggling. She clutched it tightly and tried to stand, but her legs wobbled. Mark steadied her with a gentle touch on her arm. "It's too much. It's too much to carry," she whispered, her voice cracking on the last word. Mark stayed kneeling beside her, speaking softly. "You don't have to carry everything alone." She shook her head again, as if she didn't believe him, as if she didn't deserve help. He stayed with her until her breathing slowly calmed. She didn't share the content of the letter, and Mark didn't ask. She simply sat there, quietly trying to gather herself, while he remained by her side, giving her space and support at the same time. The sun continued to lower behind the hills, casting warm, peaceful light over the ranch. Slowly, Elena lifted her head. Her eyes were tired but calmer. She murmured another quiet thank you, her voice fragile. Mark helped her stand, making sure she didn't lose her balance again. He walked her to the office door, but before she went inside, she paused and looked at him with new emotion. Something like trust. He didn't know her whole story yet, but he knew one thing for certain. The burden she carried was heavier than she could manage alone. And without even realizing it, that moment on the steps became the beginning of a promise, one he intended to keep. He watched her walk into the office. She moved slowly, but with less trembling. The letter was still in her hand. But now, she wasn't holding it alone. She carried it knowing someone stood nearby who wouldn't let her fall. Mark remained outside for a long moment, staring at the closed office door. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he would be there, quietly, steadily, ready to help her stand strong again. The next morning, Elena arrived at the ranch earlier than usual. She thought she could slip into the office quietly, start her work, and avoid any conversation about what happened the previous evening. She didn't like being seen in a moment of weakness, and she hoped Mark had already forgotten it. But deep down, she knew he hadn't. She knew he wasn't the kind of man who ignored something like that. When she entered the office, she froze in surprise. Half of her paperwork documents that usually piled up to the edge of her desk was already sorted neatly. Feed orders were arranged by date. The weekly schedules were written in clear handwriting, and some of the ledger entries she had been struggling with were already updated. She stood there silently, confused. No one else in town even knew how to organize ranch accounts properly. Only one person did: Mark. Before she could react, she heard footsteps behind her. When she turned, Mark was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed casually, as if he had been waiting for her to notice. He didn't look proud or smug. He looked calm, like helping her was the most natural thing in the world. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "But you needed it." She didn't know what to say. For a moment, she simply looked at the papers, trying to hide the way her throat tightened. She wasn't used to anyone stepping in for her. For years, she had believed that she had to handle everything alone. Mark stepped inside, removing his hat respectfully as he approached. "You're carrying too much," he said gently. "Let me help where I can." She tried to argue. She said she didn't want to trouble him, that he had his own work. that she didn't want to be a burden. But Mark didn't budge. His voice stayed calm, steady, like a person who had made a decision and wasn't going back on it. "You're not a burden," he said. "Not even close." Those words struck something deep inside her, something she had tried to bury. He simply nodded and walked out, giving her space. But his actions didn't stop there. Throughout the day, he kept finding ways to make things easier. When Elena reached for a heavy box, he appeared silently and lifted it before she even touched it. When she struggled to carry files across the ranch yard, he took them from her with a simple, "I got it." When she forgot to drink water or skipped lunch, he brought her a sandwich, wrapped neatly in paper, and left it on her desk without saying anything. At first, she tried to refuse the help. She felt guilty, even embarrassed. But slowly, she realized that he wasn't helping her out of pity. He was helping because he cared, because he couldn't watch her fall apart under the weight she carried. Later that week, Mark found her sitting behind the stable again. She wasn't crying this time, but she looked exhausted, emotionally drained, like she had been holding something too heavy inside her chest. He sat next to her on the steps, quietly. They didn't speak for several minutes. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the horses shifting in their stalls. Finally, he asked in a soft voice, "Do you want to tell me what's going on?" She hesitated. She wasn't sure she could talk about it. She had kept her problems locked away for so long that the idea of opening up scared her. But she remembered the moment she had nearly collapsed the other day. And she remembered how Mark had steadied her without judgment. So, slowly, she unfolded the letter she had been carrying in her pocket. Her fingers trembled slightly as she handed it to him. But before he could read it, she began explaining in her own words. "My family, they're losing everything," she said softly. "Our farm is in trouble. My younger brother is sick, and the medicine costs more than we can manage. I've been sending them most of my earnings, but it's still not enough." Mark listened carefully, not interrupting even once. His expression remained calm, but there was a deep concern in his eyes. "That's why you've been skipping meals?" he asked gently. She nodded. "And working late? Trying to make extra money?" Another nod. Mark closed his eyes briefly, taking in the weight of what she carried. When he looked at her again, his voice was firm but kind. "You've been fighting alone for too long." Elena swallowed hard. "I didn't know what else to do. You could have asked for help. I didn't want anyone to think I was weak." Mark shook his head. "Carrying everything alone isn't strength. Knowing when to let someone stand beside you, that's real strength." His words were simple, but they hit her like a gentle blow. She didn't know how to respond. She had always thought that asking for help meant failing. But here was Mark, looking at her as if she was one of the strongest people he had ever met. "Let me help you," he said quietly. "Let me take some of the load." Her lips trembled. She wanted to say yes, but part of her still feared accepting help. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I can see you're hurting," he said, "and because no one deserves to fight alone." For the first time, Elena didn't look away. She stared at him, seeing sincerity in his eyes. There was no hidden motive, no expectation, just genuine care. That day marked a slow change inside her. She didn't suddenly open all her wounds or abandon her responsibilities, but she allowed him in just a little. And Mark, patient as always, never asked for more than she was ready to give. Over the next several days, he became her quiet supporter. When she felt overwhelmed, he stayed close. When she grew tired, he gently encouraged her to rest. When she looked like she might break again, he found a way to steady her, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence, and sometimes just by standing near her. Wordlessly, he became her strength. One evening, a storm approached. The wind blew hard, and clouds gathered quickly over the ranch. Elena tried to finish the day's work before the rain started, but her mind kept drifting to her family. She felt helpless, worried, trapped between duty and fear. Mark approached her as she stood near the fence, staring at the sky. "You're thinking about them again," he said quietly. She nodded. "Do you want to talk?" She hesitated, then slowly began explaining more about her brother's illness, her parents' struggles, the debt on their land, and the pressure she felt every day. Mark listened with complete focus, absorbing every word. When she finished, she wiped her eyes, embarrassed to have let so much emotion show. But Mark didn't look at her with pity. Instead, he spoke with a calm reassurance. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "You don't have to carry this by yourself." She took a shaky breath. "I don't know how to let someone help," she admitted. "Then let me show you," he said softly. He stepped a little closer, not touching her, but close enough that she felt his warmth. His presence was steady, like a strong post you could lean on without fear of falling. "For now," he continued, "let me start by standing beside you. One step at a time." Elena felt something shift inside her, a weight lifting slightly. A small space opening in her chest, where air could finally move freely. It wasn't a complete relief, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. That night, as she walked home, she thought about the quiet cowboy who kept showing up when she needed it most. She realized that Mark didn't just want to help her. He wanted her to feel supported, respected, and understood. For the first time in a long while, Elena did not feel like she was drowning. She felt like someone was holding out a hand, promising that she didn't have to sink anymore. The days that followed were calmer for Elena, at least on the surface. She worked with more focus, she ate her meals regularly, and she slept a little better. Mark's steady presence helped her in ways she didn't fully understand yet. He didn't hover or pressure her. He simply showed up whenever she needed strength. Sometimes, he did it with his hands, helping carry things. Sometimes with his words, reminding her she didn't have to face everything alone. Most of the time, it was simply by being nearby, quiet and dependable. But even with his support, life didn't stop testing her. The ranch went into its busiest season. Several ranch hands took leave due to family matters. And suddenly, the crew was short of workers. They had to handle more cattle, more feed, more repairs, more of everything. And in the middle of this overwhelming workload, a new letter arrived from Elena's family, carrying news that shook her all over again. Her younger brother's condition had worsened. The doctor said he needed a treatment that was more expensive than anything they had faced before. The farm back home was barely holding together, and without help, they wouldn't make it through the month. When Elena read the letter, she felt everything inside her break again. She sat in the corner of the office, the paper trembling in her hands, tears pressing at the back of her eyes. She tried to steady her breathing, but the weight was too much. She felt the same helpless fear she had felt weeks ago, maybe even stronger now. Mark found her there. He had come to deliver tools he had borrowed from the office shed, but when he stepped inside, he saw her small frame curled slightly, her shoulders shaking. He walked to her slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal that might run if startled. When he reached her, he didn't speak right away. He sat beside her, not too close, not too far, just close enough to let her know he was there. This time, she didn't try to hide her pain. She didn't force a smile or pretend she was fine. She held the letter tightly and looked at him with eyes full of fear. Mark reached out his hand, wordlessly asking for the letter, his brow slowly tightening. When he finished, he folded it carefully and returned it to her. "Elena," he said softly, "this is a lot for anyone to face." Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I don't know what to do." "You don't have to know everything right now," he replied gently. "We'll figure it out together." She shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "You've already done so much for me. I can't ask you for more." "You didn't ask," Mark said. "I'm offering." She looked at him, eyes full of doubt, fear, and exhaustion. "Why?" she whispered again. Mark breathed in slowly, thinking carefully before he answered. Because you care so much for your family that you're carrying all this pain alone, he said. That kind of heart deserves to be protected. And because, he paused, meeting her eyes with a rare openness. Because I don't want to see you break. The truth in his voice made her chest tighten in a different way, not from fear, but something warm, almost reassuring. She looked down at her hands, wiping her tears slowly. That evening, after the ranch work was done, Mark walked her home. The sky was glowing with the last touch of sunset, painting the land in soft orange and pink. They didn't speak much during the walk, but it wasn't a heavy silence. It felt like the kind of quiet shared by two people who understood each other's pain without needing to fill the space with words. The next morning, Mark took action. Before sunrise, he visited the general store, the feed supplier, and even a few ranchers in neighboring areas. He asked if anyone needed extra hands, even small jobs. He explained the situation, not every detail, but enough for people to understand that he was trying to help a family in trouble. Word spread quickly in a town like theirs, and people responded. By midday, Mark had collected several offers. A farmer outside town needed help repairing fences. A retired rancher needed someone to organize his old barn. A shopkeeper needed help stacking supplies. None of these jobs paid much, but together, they could add up to enough money to send to Elena's family. Mark returned to the ranch with a list of tasks and the names of people willing to help. She looked calmer than the day before, but still worn, with dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. When he handed her the list, she stared at it, confused. "What is this?" she asked. "Work," Mark said simply. "Small jobs. The town is willing to help your family." Elena blinked, unable to fully understand what she was seeing. "You asked all these people?" she said in disbelief. "I did. For me? For your family," he corrected gently. She looked up at him, her voice filled with emotion. "Mark, you didn't have to do this." He gave her a soft smile. "I know. But I wanted to." She pressed the list to her chest, tears forming again. "You moved half the town," she whispered. "People want to help when they know someone is hurting," he replied. "You've been carrying your family alone for so long. Now it's time to let others carry you for a change." Elena took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions, but they spilled over anyway. She covered her mouth, crying softly, not from fear this time, but from relief. Mark stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. For the first time since her brother got sick, she believed those words. Over the next few days, Mark helped organize everything. He drove her to the places offering work. He helped her complete tasks that required extra strength. He even spoke to the town doctor, who agreed to review her brother's medical papers for free. Elena watched all this unfold with rising amazement. She had never experienced this kind of support, never imagined people would come together like this for her. But as much as she appreciated the town's help, the heaviest moment came when she sat alone with Mark one evening after they returned from finishing a job. She felt guilty again, guilty that he was doing so much for her. "Mark," she said softly, "I don't deserve all this." He turned to her, surprised. "Why do you think that?" "I just..." She struggled to find words. "I've always handled everything alone. I thought asking for help meant I failed." Mark shook his head firmly. "No," he said. "Carrying everything alone is what breaks people. Letting someone help, that's what keeps you standing." "There." She swallowed hard. "I still feel like I shouldn't accept so much from you." He looked at her with steady eyes. "You're not taking advantage of anyone. You're letting people care about you. That's not weakness. It's human." She looked away, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. "Mark, what if I lean on you too much?" He answered without hesitation. "Then I'll hold steady." His words were simple, but they reached deep inside her. She felt something shift again, another layer of fear falling away. That night, she went home feeling lighter. Not because her problems were gone, they were still there. Still heavy, but because someone was holding one side of that weight with her. From that day forward, something changed between them. She trusted him more, opened up more, allowed herself to lean on him without feeling guilty. And Mark, true to his nature, kept showing up, patient and unwavering. Life still threw challenges at her, but she no longer faced them alone. Whenever another burden appeared, another letter, another worry, another long day, she found Mark standing beside her, ready to share the load. And slowly, quietly, something warm began growing in the space between them. Not rushed, not forced, just natural, like two people finding comfort in each other's presence, without even realizing how deeply their connection was forming. In the weeks that followed, life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm for Elena. The weight on her shoulders did not disappear overnight, but it grew lighter, piece by piece, because she was no longer holding it alone. Mark's help, the town's support, and the simple comfort of knowing she didn't have to face every problem by herself. These things brought a quiet strength back into her life. Her brother's condition began to improve. The doctor who reviewed his papers had suggested a change in treatment, and with the extra financial help from the town's odd jobs, her family was able to afford it. Each letter she received from home carried better news than the last. Her parents wrote with hope again, and her brother's handwriting, once shaky, grew steadier. Elena read each letter with a grateful heart, knowing none of it would have been possible without Mark stepping in the way he had. One cool morning, Elena stood outside the ranch office, enjoying a gentle breeze. The sun had just risen, casting a warm glow across the fields. Birds chirped softly, and the horses moved lazily in their stalls. Everything felt peaceful. She breathed deeply, feeling gratitude fill her from the inside. She turned when she heard footsteps and saw Mark walking toward her. He carried a toolbox in one hand and a rope in the other, ready for a day of repairs and cattle work. He nodded a quiet greeting, and she smiled softly. "You look calmer these days," he said, observing her with that steady attention she had come to know. "I feel calmer," she replied. "Everything at home is getting better." "That's good to hear," Mark said with a genuine smile. She looked down at her hands and then back up at him. "Because of you." He shook his head. "Because of you. You didn't give up. Your family didn't give up. And you?" she asked gently. "Where do you fit in?" Mark paused. For a moment, he looked like he wasn't sure how much to say. Then, in that honest, simple way of his, he answered, "I stood beside you. That's all." But Elena knew better. Standing beside someone in their hardest moments was not all. It was everything. Later that afternoon, the ranch grew busy again. A group of cattle wandered too far toward the southern fence, and Mark had to ride out quickly to bring them back. Elena watched from the office window as he guided his horse with skill and calm strength. Even from afar, Mark looked steady, someone who never backed away from difficult tasks. By evening, the sky turned golden, and Mark returned, dusty, but smiling faintly. Elena waited outside with a cup of cold water. He took it with a grateful nod, drinking slowly as he stood beside her. "You didn't have to wait for me," he said. "I wanted to," she replied. For a moment, the air between them grew warm, filled with something unspoken but deeply felt. Neither of them voiced it, but both of them sensed it, something shifting, something growing. As the sun dipped behind the hills, they walked together toward the barn. Mark had tools to put away, and Elena often helped him organize the shelves. It had become their quiet evening routine. Inside the barn, the soft golden light filtered through the wooden slats, casting long shadows across the hay-covered floor. Elena handed Mark a hammer, and as he placed it on the shelf, she said softly, Mark, can I tell you something? He turned toward her, wiping dust from his hands. Of course. She took a breath, her voice gentle. I haven't felt this supported, this safe, in years. Mark stood still, listening carefully. You helped my family, she continued. You helped me. You didn't ask for anything. You just showed up. Every day. That's what people do for each other, he said modestly. She shook her head. Not everyone. Mark looked at her for a long moment. He didn't speak right away, as if he wanted to make sure he understood her completely. Elena, he said softly. Her breath caught at his words. She looked down for a second, then back at him, her eyes warm with emotion. I know, she whispered. The barn fell into a gentle silence. The horses shifted in their stalls. The evening wind brushed against the walls, and dust floated lazily in the sunbeams. But neither of them moved away. Elena stepped closer, not touching him, but close enough for him to feel her presence. When you said I wasn't alone anymore, I believed you. Truly. I meant it, he said. There was something new in Mark's voice, soft but certain, strong but tender. And I want you to know something too, she said. You helped me stand again. But you didn't just carry my problems. You helped me find myself. Mark listened quietly, his gaze steady. So now, she continued, her voice steady and sincere, I don't just want to be someone you help. She paused. I want to stand with you too. Mark blinked, almost surprised by the emotion behind her words. He wasn't used to people offering him support. He was always the one doing the helping, the carrying, the steadying. You already do, he said simply. She smiled, warm and soft. Maybe. But I want to do it more. Not because I owe you anything, but because I care too. Something gentle passed across Mark's face, relief, gratitude, and something deeper. Something that had been waiting quietly in his heart. He looked at her with an expression Elena had only seen once before on the day she nearly fell apart, and he told her she wasn't alone. Then, we stand together, he said softly. Her smile widened just slightly. Together. For a moment, neither of them moved. The feeling between them was quiet, steady, and beautiful, like the kind of bond that didn't need grand gestures or loud declarations. It was a connection built from shared burdens, soft words, silent moments, and the simple truth that two hearts can find strength in each other. In the following days, nothing dramatic happened. They continued working side by side. They shared lunches under the shade of tall trees. They talked during slow evenings, sometimes about worries, sometimes about dreams, sometimes about nothing at all. But everything felt meaningful. The ranch workers noticed too. They didn't gossip loudly or make jokes. They simply watched with warm smiles as the quiet cowboy and the hard-working woman grew closer, in a gentle, respectful way. One evening, after a long day of work, Elena walked to the hill behind the ranch. It was a peaceful place where she often went to think. She sat on the grass, watching the sunset paint the sky with soft pink and orange colors. A few minutes later, she heard footsteps. She didn't turn. She already knew who it was. Mark sat beside her, leaving a comfortable space between them. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. Finally, Elena said, Do you ever wonder how things would have turned out if you hadn't found me crying on those steps? Mark thought for a moment. I think, he said slowly, I would have found another moment. Another sign. Something else that told me you were hurting. She smiled softly. Why do you say that? Because people can hide their pain for a while, he replied, but not forever. And I would have kept looking, not because I was trying to pry, but because I care about you. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of wild grass and earth. She looked at Mark with quiet gratitude. You helped me stand strong, she said. And you helped me feel something I haven't felt in a long time, Mark responded. A reason to pay attention. A reason to stay close. They shared another peaceful silence. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the land in golden light. Elena rested her hand on the grass between them. Mark noticed, glanced at her gently, then placed his hand near hers, not touching, but close enough that she felt the warmth. A small gesture, but enough to say everything. When the sun finally set and the sky deepened into twilight, they stood together and walked back toward the ranch, side by side, their shadows merging in the fading light. From that day on, no matter what challenge came their way, Elena no longer whispered, "It's too much to carry," because she knew, with complete certainty, that she never had to carry anything alone again. And Mark, he walked forward with a quiet smile, knowing he had found someone worth standing beside for the rest of his days.